It's such a pleasure and privilege to have Xu Bin as a CRASSH Visiting Professor give lectures to Cambridge and also did a small installation at the Fitzwilliam Museum. If you still haven't had the chance to see the exhibition, please do come to the Chinese Gallery at the Fitzwilliam Museum. And installation will be end by the end of May, so you still have a month's time. Can I introduce my first speaker in the second panel? Rose Holmes. She is the Junior Research Fellow in Art History at Christ Church, Oxford University. And her talk will be Between Mountains and the Seas. Would you please welcome the Rose Holmes?
No, thank you for inviting me here. It's wonderful to be part of this symposium today. Okay, so in 2006, the artist Chuan Xiong began work on the new book of the mountains and the seas, a 3-channel video animation whose 3rd installment is due to be released this year. Chu's video creatively combines elements of the pre-Qin dynasty classical text, the Shanhai Jing, or Classic of the Mountains and the Seas, with explicit references to contemporary political, social, and ecological concerns. Tracing the evolution of Chinese society from the agricultural through the post-industrial to the global, the video subjects the modern history of China to close scrutiny and complicates the recent trend for combining digital media technologies with a retrospective look at China's cultural past. Created using thousands of monochrome acrylic canvases, which were individually photographed and digitized using stop-motion techniques, Chu's animated narratives play with the formal power of acrylic to mirror the so-called traditional practice of ink painting. This paper seeks to examine Chu's work in relation to earlier 20th century ink animations, focusing particular attention on the works of To Wei. Now, this earlier 20th century animator also created works which were frequently adapted from historical and classical texts and employed so-called traditional techniques, such as paper cutting and ink painting, to create what was considered a distinctly Chinese art form. While these early animations were frequently required to stand in synecdochic relation to the culture from which they originated, they were nevertheless involved in a transnational dialogue with Eastern European, Soviet, and even American animation techniques and practices. This paper therefore explores what was at stake in this early articulation of a national style, examining the broader entanglement of animation aesthetics within modern historical discourses of China. Now, reading Chu's work in relation to these earlier animations provides the opportunity to reflect on the aesthetic reconstruction of ink painting in contemporary art, exploring how artists have frequently played with the formal qualities of the medium in order to confound concepts of tradition and contemporaneity, and thus question processes of cultural and artistic demarcation. Reflecting a more complex set of concerns regarding the ontology of contemporary art within China, both Chu's and these early 20th century animated works challenge our perceptions of a generic or homogeneous national identity, and instead situate ink animation within a broader search for more critical points of cultural reference. So ink and wash animation, or 水墨动画, also known as brush painting animation, was first developed as a specific category of Chinese animation by the Shanghai Animation Studio in the 1950s. Prized for offering a cinematic mimesis of modern landscape painting, it sought to reproduce the visual effects of ink brush work through a cinematographic procedure using a combination of cutouts, stenciled images, paintings created on paper, and animated cells. Now, the development of this technique was linked to a wider debate within Chinese animation, which was focused on the creation of a distinct and national animated style. Now, most histories of Chinese animation link this pursuit to an event that transpired in 1955, when the animated film, 五鸦为什么是黑的, or Why Are Crows Black, which was the first Chinese colour animation, won the award for Best Animated Film at the Venice Film Festival. The makers of the film, the Wan brothers, who are themselves very famous animators, were displeased, however, when the work was mistaken for a Soviet production. Incited by this, Toei, who was then head of the Shanghai Animation Studios, hung a slogan on the wall of the studio that called upon his colleagues to explore a national way of animation. The pursuit of this national style was therefore inextricably linked from its inception to a reaction against a perceived lack of distinct Chinese characteristics, or so-called traditional elements, by a foreign audience. Politically depreciated for not displaying sufficient ethnic character, the assumption that the film had come from either Soviet Russia or Eastern European studios was enough to incite a renewed exploration of so-called traditional art forms and their subsequent adoption into a range of animated filmmaking practices. Now, a common feature of these animations was also the adaptation of traditional myths, legends, and folklore as narrative content for these animation texts, since these texts were the literary references that could accurately translate, and I quote, the spiritual essentials of Chinese culture into animation language. So in 1960, then Vice Premier Chen Yu visited an exhibition dedicated to film animation and indicated his desire that the work of the well-known contemporary painter Qi Baishi would one day be animated. Collaborating with Chen Jiajun, Toei created the 1960 animation Xiaofan Zhao Mama, which was given the English title Where is Mama? With this film, the animators took the traditional form of ink painting, exemplified by Qi Baishi, and developed a means of animating the brushstrokes so that they could represent a school of tadpoles swimming gracefully through the water in search of their mother. The narrative of the film itself animates a verse that accompanied one of Qi Baishi's ink paintings. The film won awards at Annecy, Cannes, and Locarno, making the animation world take note of the films that were being produced by the Shanghai Animation Studio. As Toei commented in the 1960s, we were beginning to develop Chinese brush painting as an animation technique. The first of these films, Where is Mama?, marked the turning point in the production of animation. I showed that this art form, which had initially been imported, had been completely absorbed into Chinese culture. And if I can, I'm going to show you a brief clip from this. I might have to forward this a bit. Sorry. And I'll show another brief part of him. Sorry, I have to cut it short. You can see them. They're actually, most of these films are actually on YouTube. So if you go back and put them into Google, they should come up. So Toei returned to the technique of ink animation 3 years later in the 1963 animated film Modi, or The Cowherder's Flute. The work was praised as a landscape painting in process and as an homage to the painter Li Keran, who frequently depicted similar subject matter in his own ink paintings. And this is a shot of Toei collaborating on that production. Now, possibly the most famous ink animation, however, is Toei's 1988 film Shanshuiqing, or Feelings from Mountain and Water, which narrates the story of the bond between an aging musician and his young protege. Much of the artwork of the film draws heavily on traditional landscape painting as its core aesthetic value, using primarily different shades of ink to lend contrast, depth, and fluidity to the image and movement. The visualization of the deep, intimate, and non-verbal relationship between the mentor and his pupil is displayed through the synthesis of the narrative text and the ink and wash technique, the sound effects and the music, resulting in a film which embodied what the animators considered to be a distinct and uniquely Chinese animation aesthetic and philosophy. And again, I'll give you a short clip. From 1956 to 1999, 47 Chinese animated films, including Feelings from Mountain and Water, Where's Mama, and The Cowherder's Flute, amongst others, gained 72 awards from international film festivals. The success of many of these films is attributed by critics to their visible examination and adoption of so-called traditional aesthetics, and their experimentation with forms and narratives that did not conform to the mainstream animation of their times. As Chinese film commentator Lulu notes, and I quote, "The great success of Chinese animation rests primarily on its exploration of nationality. A special term was therefore bestowed on the aesthetic achievements of Chinese animation artists, the 中国动画学派, or Chinese School of Animation, as an acknowledgement of their distinctly non-Disney aesthetics. Composed of texts that were frequently adapted from myths, legends, and poetic verse, and employing so-called traditional techniques such as paper cutting, paper folding, and the medium of ink and wash, Chinese meishu, or art film, constituted a zone of mediation between the CCP's cultural policy and cinematic formation, between the state and animation spectatorship, and between local and international audiences. The problem of balancing these visualities, of borrowing modern cinematic elements and techniques to tell traditional stories in traditional art forms, and finding a distinct Chinese style that could be appreciated by both domestic and international audiences, offered a distinct challenge to many artists and animators, challenges that one could argue continue to resurface in the present. Hu Jubin notes that Chinese national cinema, like its European counterparts, mostly developed in constant dialogue with Hollywood. The tension between globalization and national-style animation production has therefore been in existence from its inception and is not completely divorced from the realities of the contemporary art world. Examining the aesthetic reconstruction of ink and wash techniques in contemporary animation therefore allows us to engage not just with the continued developments of animation aesthetics and the advancements wrought by digital technologies, but also enables us to examine and acknowledge certain cultural continuities and points of visual correspondence. Turning now to the new book of The Mountains and the Seas, which is a 30-minute, 3-channel video animation which is based on a classical Chinese text of the same name. The Shanghai Jing, or Classic of the Mountains and the Seas, was created sometime between 500 BCE and 200 CE, although its exact authorship and origin is unknown. Most extant copies currently date it to around the Ming Dynasty. Investigating the world outside of human society, the original text is revered not just as a fabled geographic and cultural account of pre-Qin dynasty China, but also as a plenitude of fables, supernatural entities, and natural anomalies. It was also one of the earliest Chinese works that sought to provide a taxonomic reckoning of the landscape, including its natural geography, flora and fauna, and regional produce. As such, it has also been read as highlighting the interest of the literati of that time in a world concept, or literally the biophysical and socio-anthropological environment in which they conceived of themselves as being an integral part of the cosmos, and intrinsically connected with its spiritual, physical, and moral attributes. Chu's updated version of the new Book of the Mountains and the Seas begins with an image of the sea, whose undulating waves are depicted against a cloud-filled sky using a monochrome palette of greys and blacks characteristic of ink painting. An island emerges in the middle of the ocean, which gradually grows larger, until the 3-channel video splits into separate screens, which depict aspects of the scenery in more detail. When the images synchronize again, the land depicted in the first scene is cultivated, cities rise, and the trees and forests give way to clusters of black buildings and the silhouettes of darkened highways. Through the animation process, Chu gradually shows the natural world transformed into a modern urban environment. I'm going to try and play a clip from... Chu's animated film, however, explores concerns beyond China's urbanization and environmental degradation. In later scenes, tanks shaped like elephants appear alongside automobiles resembling turtles. Long-winged flying monsters parody military helicopters, whilst creatures reminiscent of stingrays mimic the actions of stealth fighter planes. These images can be read in the context of post-9/11 military and political conflicts, including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the resultant destruction of human life, as well as the ongoing battle for control of natural resources amidst the threat of chemical warfare and nuclear weapons. By tracing the evolution of society from the agricultural through the post-industrial to the global, Chu thus employs a register of animalistic and mechanical forms to search for political and social relevancy. The process by which Chu created this animation is worth elaborating in more depth. The artist paints a scene such as a landscape, which acts as the background against which various elements are added or subtracted through the application of acrylic paint. He uses stop-motion filming to record minute changes on a single painting and repeats this process throughout the 30 or 40 paintings in the animation, which are then intercut to create the final work, in which animated events appear to develop over time. Recorded through their various stages of evolution, each painting therefore yields about 100 animation cells. Through this painstaking and laborious process, Chu's animated narratives, painted in acrylic onto canvas, photographed, repainted, rephotographed, and finally pieced together digitally, display a hybridity of media. According to the artist, acrylic rather than ink was chosen because it is relatively malleable, remains wet for long periods of time, and allows Chu to modify his work with relative ease. It can thus accurately mirror the appearance of ink painting whilst allow greater versatility than other traditional media. The animation's mode of presentation, however, also plays with traditional aesthetic conventions. The extended horizontality of Chu's paintings are represented in his choice of 3-channel video, which maintains a recognizable association with traditional hand scrolls, such as the one shown here. The prescribed mode of viewing hand scrolls requires the viewer to slowly unfurl the painting and thus progress from one section or frame to the next, a process which constitutes a formidable precursor to filmic structures, including, of course, animation. In most of the exhibition contexts within which the new Book of the Mountains and the Seas has been shown, including at the Shanghai Biennale in 2006, 2008, a Manchester Asia Triennale, a San Diego Museum's animated painting exhibition in 2008, and most recently, obviously, was the Met's large-scale 2013 exhibition ink art, past as present in contemporary China. Most written commentaries of the new books in the Mountain Seas have all referred to the work as an ink animation created using traditional ink and brush techniques. Regardless of whether the curators or writers are conscious of their error or not, their decision to deliberately market it as such and choose choice to perhaps deliberately obscure the distinction between the two points to a hierarchy in which the primacy of the ink and brush technique as a more Chinese and therefore more appropriate media with which to identify this work is reinforced. As Paula Wocki notes, and I quote, "The high cultural context of this type of experimental animation has certainly helped this visual form to be acknowledged as one of the most important developments in Chinese contemporary art." These intentional ambiguities similarly provoke an examination of the kinds of taxonomies which govern the choice of artworks and displays of contemporary Chinese art, both internationally and within the People's Republic of China. Chu's melding of archaean source text with contemporary events, his use of acrylic to mirror ink painting and split-screen animations in imitation of a scroll format, combined with stylistic forms of cartooning and illustration, and a sensibility perhaps indebted to Japanese anime's prevalent use of extreme natural conditions as metaphor for unrestrained nature, results in the new Book of the Mountains and the Seas presenting a hybridized representation of the confluence of so-called traditional Chinese elements with contemporary computerization. I've sought to illustrate that there are certain continuities in Chu and Tuwei's work which extend beyond a similarity of media and adoption of so-called traditional techniques, or in Chu's case, the semblance of these techniques. Chu's decision to adopt an animation style which appears to mimic traditional modes of ink animation articulates more than a search for greater cultural relevance and positioning by carving out a distinctly Chinese identity in an increasingly competitive and homogenized art world. With the globalization of consumer markets for contemporary art and the digitalization of information streams in the current century, contemporary animation from China is reaching larger audiences than ever before, especially the form of internationally endorsed avant-garde animation exemplified by Chu. The new Book of the Mountains and the Seas therefore reflects a complex set of concerns regarding the ontology of contemporary art within China, not just by amplifying a perceived Chineseness, but also by challenging how curators realize the frequent claim to represent China when they present contemporary art, as well as how artists relate to cultural traditions and link an often imagined past with the present and the future in their artistic practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose, for the interesting talk. If you haven't had the chance to see the movie, then you have a chance this coming long weekend, bank holiday weekend. Now, I would like to introduce the second speaker, McCausland. Is a reader of Chinese art history at SOAS. Before SOAS, he was the head curator at Chester Beatty Library, and now he's preparing an interesting abstract painting in Shanghai Dragon Museum, Long Boguan, which is one of the richest private museums in China, in June. So if you have chance to see this amazing coming new exhibition, to go. Shen.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much. So the title is Living Tradition in the Frame. And the idea is to think about whether tradition is alive and to kind of frame the idea of tradition within the contemporary. So I thought I would show you an example of a contemporary piece of contemporary East Asian architecture built in 2013. Ha ha ha, right? This is also, I can say with no correction, also a monumental example of one of the longest traditions of East Asian architecture, the Ise Shrine, ritually destroyed and rebuilt every couple of decades since the year 692, so the next rebuilding is 2033. The point here I'm making is monumentality in East Asian architecture doesn't lie in the permanence of the bricks and the mortar, but it lies in the serial commemorative engagement of passing generations. And I wonder what that can suggest to us about how we might think about contemporary art, about tradition in contemporary art. So to respond to that question, let's observe that a very similar model of transmission was co-opted by scholars in China at the time of when they formed a social class by the 11th century. So here's an example. In a recorded colophon to Li Gonglin's legendary scroll of 5 tribute horses, painted in around 1100, 200 years later, writing, this was Zhao Mengfu, observed that with the passing years, Li Gonglin's horses did not age, but in fact, they were revitalized because they became models for each succeeding generation of scholar painters, including himself. And he contrasted Li Gonglin's horses with the stone horses crumbling away at the Zhaoling, the tomb of Tang Taizong, near Xi'an. Perhaps he was thinking of the horses on the Spirit Road, which have, of course, long gone, replaced by kitsch examples for the modern visitor like these ones. Or perhaps he was thinking of the famous relief sculptures of Tang Taizong's 6 Liu Jun, his war horses, which were presumably already cracked and crumbling in the year 1300. This is one in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Perhaps he was even thinking of what Li Gonglin's model were, and this was the rubbing copies of the same horses. And I'm going to add one of my own examples, since this brings a tear to my eye. So when I went to visit Zhao Mengfu's tomb in 2005, the whole place was crumbling, and even more so the horses on his very own Spirit Road. So that kind of hammered home the point. But Zhao Mengfu's own paintings, by contrast, are done in this seemingly very fragile mode of silk painting, on a painting on silk. But this painting is in obviously very excellent condition in the Palace Museum in Beijing. So Zhao Mengfu's point was that Li Gonglin's divine horses, in inspiring scholar painters generation after generation, could be handed down in the same way as this one was. So contrary to expectation, if things are transmitted in ephemeral media, they seem to outlast things which were in permanent materials like stone. But I think we should be careful here. We mustn't be deceived by the rhetoric into thinking that transmission just means slavishly copying. We need to be aware that tradition can be a ruse or an alibi or a conceit. And in Zhao Mengfu's own painting, for example, this is highly realistic, highly representational. It doesn't have the lateral or frontal qualities that Li Gonglin's painting had, or even those earlier horses, but it uses foreshortening, and it uses a high-angle viewpoint, and it uses movement. These are all technically very difficult to achieve, far beyond what was happening 200 years earlier in their complexity. And another point might even be the recession into space that you see depicted behind as well. So technically, Zhao Mengfu's painting is far more advanced scientifically than Li Gonglin's, but he very convincingly masks this under the rhetoric of paying lip service to tradition. And bear in mind also that the wider context of this is a growing dominance of a very literary way of looking at things. You can imagine how this might become entrenched. So what's the agency of the past in this context? It provides what American politicians might call political cover. It's a kind of blueprint for a contemporary iteration of a subject matter, giving it authority. But a horse like this is obviously utterly transformed by being portrayed, by being painted in a completely different context. So, just to crudely recap, stone horses seem to be permanent, but they crumble. Ones painted on paper or silk seem ephemeral, but are perpetually transformed, or as Zhao Mengfu put it, they live forever. So I want to have a think generally in the time that remains about transmission, appropriation, and reiteration of particular visual devices in contemporary China. But before I do that, I just want to frame the idea of contemporary Chinese artists looking at China. What I mean here is that there are choices. I just want to try and illustrate that for a moment. So sticking with Zhao Mengfu for the first example, his autumn colors in the Jianghua Mountains, when in 1693 it was copied by Yu Zhiding, Kangxi court painter, I think it's become obvious by this point that the painting was fairly iconic, but it's the kind of painting also that contemporary artists, painters and photographers, Zhang Hongtu and Hong Lei respectively, also like to play with. They're obviously delving straight back into the China's old master tradition to play with it. Now, a sequence like this emphasizes that transmission and that tradition, but what does it occlude at the same time? One of the things is obviously the technical changes. Another might also be the way that with those changes, it's effectively a way of commenting. And the third thing it seems to obscure is the way that the same image recontextualized might have a completely different meaning or function. There are plenty of other examples one could produce. Here's Ding Yi. James has given him a plug. I don't need to give him another plug. But Ding Yi was one of the artists in the late 1980s who turned to a completely different tradition outside China. He turned to the Western tradition in the form of modernism, right? So it's a choice, right? Already becoming a choice. An artist, he was looking at Broadway Boogie Woogie, which just went across the screen there. An artist like Cai Guoqiang has taken Chinese tradition and, in a site-specific way, put it into another context outside China, bringing gunpowder medicine, huoyao, so Chinese invention, to a non-Chinese context. And then you get the more radical artists, or let's say avant-gardists of today. There's a tremendous vogue for working with the body. At the moment, Ren Hang is the photographer everyone seems to be talking about in this context. This is a work from 2014. And so anyone who went last year to Tim Clark's exhibition at the British Museum of Hokusai and the Hokusai's erotica will immediately start to make connections like this. I'm really showing you this to illustrate that contemporary artists might well look at Japanese pornography of historical period, or you might get Chinese artists taking Chinese stuff. There are all sorts of different choices. There are choices to what tradition, where, and when. Now, what I want to do in the time that remains here, just quickly, is to try and think about two things: landscape and scrolling. And I want to do this, I'm mainly going to focus on a very short section. I don't think I really have time to play it all, but a very short section of this film, Jia Zhangke's Still Life, the good people of the Three Gorges. Now, although the English title is called Still Life, there is actually some action in this film, which is set in rural South China in a post-socialist context, during the building of the Three Gorges Dam between 1994 and 2006. Obviously, one can hardly get more iconic in terms of landscape than that. The film basically interweaves two narratives, two human narratives, with the epic national narrative. The individuals are trying to find their spouses. The epic or national narrative is obviously the development of the nation, the development of infrastructure. And I picked a couple of examples to look at quickly. One is towards the end of the film, where in this frame, the miner has met his long-lost wife, and they have a conversation on the right-hand side. They don't say very much, but they sit there. And then suddenly a building at the back, this building here, just crumbles, and they suddenly stand up, and then the attention goes back to them. So without us really knowing it, the cinematographer is making us move, making our eye move within these frames, within the frame itself, shifting us around, and we're not even very sure to be able to articulate what exactly is happening. That's one of many devices. The one I want to focus on a little bit more happens at another point in the film where we get more of these kind of scrolling, languid vistas around the three gorges. Obviously, all this is the landscape that's about to disappear. But at one point, using a device, the artist uses a device called recursion. I'll come back to what recursion is in a minute. The Chinese for recursion is apparently digui, but probably doesn't mean much more in Chinese than it does in English. But at any rate, this is an example of it. The minor character looks at a scene of the gorges, and he takes out the 10-yuan note and he compares it, looking one to the other. And obviously at this point there's lots of all the sort of the poetry, the tongue poetry that's associated with this Li Bai's poem Zao Fa Bai Li Cheng, and Mao Zedong's kind of commemoration of it and writing of it in calligraphy. All of that, all this kind of historical, literary and visual stuff is all interlayered. Just come back to this recursion thing for a moment and just explain a little more about what it is. Recursions happen a lot. We don't always notice them. They happen in music, maths, language, or in images. And it's a colleague of mine in ethnomusicology, Richard Widdis, who showed me it in music. I'm showing you an example in geometry. The example is Sierpinski's triangle from 1915. Essentially, this is where you can take a single form, divide it or make it smaller, and then it can be repeated so that it repeats itself in steps ad infinitum. It can also happen in images, such as here, where an image is repeated within itself. So obviously it's very good for advertising and stuff, but it also appears in examples here. And I wondered, Xubing, I'm not sure if your Dishu actually has this example yet, but here's an example of recursion. You'll see on the box for your dog's business, it's got a recursive example, so the picture repeats itself within. And that's Coco you see there. Anyway, in the scene in Still Life, you get a kind of recursion in the way that the banknote repeats the image that you're actually also looking at in the film. Other recursions happening at the same time are the commemoration of the poetry, the way that we are vicariously visiting it, because we constantly hear the sound of the tour guides on these boats going up and down. It's in the lower shot that it becomes quite interesting, because the hand holding the note is held as if it's our hand, and we, as it were, become the person holding it. We become the miner. And at that point, we kind of get a premonition of what's about to happen when the water will have risen. So there's a rather complex and elaborate irony to the way that the landscape, with all of this tradition of commemoration, the way it's all about to come to an end through the eyes of this visiting miner, and in fact to be displaced by another one, the modern narrative of development, utilitarian narrative. Now, I was thinking a little bit about recursions and how that might relate to tradition. Actually, it does relate to tradition quite a lot. If you go to the locus classicus of landscape in landscape painting, and that would be this scene in the Admonitions scroll, this is quite an interesting case of a recursion as well. I'm not saying they're directly related, but I just want to illustrate how it works. So in the Admonitions scroll, this scene here is scene 6, is meant to illustrate with a pyramid form, which is a very stable form, is meant to illustrate building a mountain out of dust as a way to illustrate how difficult it is to create a great dynasty. This category of painting belongs to the category called gushihua, or story paintings, or monoscenic paintings which depict momentous political events. And it's quite exemplary of the canonical role ascribed to painting as a visual repository of memory and wisdom in China's great tradition of statecraft. And in a sense, that scene from Still Life does that as well. So here, this one is quite literally a mountain that has been built out of dust by the regime, which is also quite a good analogy for building a dam, I thought. When one looks at the admonitions, one tends to think of it as something that happens scene by scene. But if you think of it instead as part of a larger narrative, some rather curious formal devices start to appear, such as repetition and, you guessed it, recursion. Let me illustrate how this happens. So I'm picking out mainly scenes 6 and 9 here. Scene 6, Scene 6, I've already introduced. It's the mountain and hunter. Scene 9 in the bottom left is the one about the family. So the text says, if the women of the court behave correctly, i.e. they receive the emperor's favor according to the rota of menstrual cycles, etc., so that they will have the maximum number of children, then that will bring about harmony and stability. And what's really interesting is how the painter reused the same shape of the mountain to illustrate the stability that will result from women behaving in this particular way. You see the same shape is reused, the pyramid shape. But what's recursive about the second one is the way that it can then be divided into further triangles. So you have a triangle here, triangle here, triangle here, a recursion similar to Sierpinski's triangle. But it doesn't just end there, because the recursions, the pyramids, happen not just in the frontal plane, but also in the ground plane within the picture. So you actually get double recursions working at the same time. Picture plane obviously is flat up in the surface, ground plane is the ground going back. So both of them have these triangular forms working within it. And it's not just the way the artist plays with space, he's also playing with time. I think in a very similar way, or in a similar fashion, surfaces in the same scene in still life. So here you can imagine, if this is the present, I mean, you could regard it all as in the present, as a single moment. But you could also say, well, look, this is the nursery, these are the screaming children. This is the schoolroom, this is the teacher, they're a little bit older, and here you have finally the emperor. And the way it all starts again, of course, is this extraordinarily erotically charged look between these two individuals. The whole thing starts off again in that way. That puts a very interesting lateral. That lateral angle between those two obviously then draws attention to the opposite angle, which is our point of entry into the painting. And what's interesting here is we don't get to be part of this erotic story, as it were, across the front. Our job actually is we're relegated to the schoolroom at the back, and that's obviously quite appropriate in this particular scroll. But what's really interesting, I think, is the way that what they're looking at is what we're looking at. The artist, in other words, has placed his own image, his own scroll, within the painting itself. And this is an example of what in our barbarous jargon of art historians we call mediality. Now, just to try and draw this together, thinking back to still life, whether the medieval audiences of the Admonition scroll thought of the painting that way is really beside the point here. It's quite likely, given the way that the critical tradition was developing at the time. But what I find encouraging here is that when we find these parallels of devices like recursions and framing and mediality between two images like this, we don't really, well, I certainly don't, go around insisting that the contemporary artist has been influenced by tradition. I don't even insist that the contemporary artist is appropriating tradition. The reality seems to be that contemporary artists like Jiang, they wear Chinese tradition very lightly. In still life, the tradition is ever present, but its being invoked is actually a way to call attention to the fact that it's about to disappear under the rising floodwater and beneath the cloak of pollution and smog. So as the frame around the 10 yuan banknote shows. It is literally impossible to see beyond this moment in this scene. But perhaps it's not as depressing as that. The boat going upriver tells us that life goes on. So it seems to me images like this carry a great responsibility, but quite lightly. They suggest to us how they would be in the future, reminders of a past or a tradition that we will have witnessed disappearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Shen, for another interesting talk.